duration here. So, did Jesus call himself God? Here's an outline of what I'm going to talk about. First, I'm going to talk about Jesus in the fourth gospel. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The fourth gospel is the Gospel of John. And in the Gospel of John, it is quite clear. In the Gospel of John, Jesus thinks of himself as God. It's unambiguous, I think, that Jesus' divinity is clear in the Gospel of John, and Jesus declares himself to be divine in the Gospel of John. Now, the clearest evidence of this is one I'm not going to put up as one of my examples, but just so you understand the clearest evidence of this, that it's actually in John chapter 15, verse 1. This is irrefutable, I think. It's where Jesus tells his disciples, I am divine, you are the branches. John 15:1. Quite clear, unambiguous. Jesus is divine. Apart from that passage, Jesus in the Gospel of John, Jesus says things that make it quite clear. In John, he portrays himself as God. Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am. Abraham lived 1,800 years before Jesus. Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am. And when he says, I am, he's claiming the name of God from the book of Exodus. Exodus chapter 3, Moses asked God, what's your name? And God says, I am. That's God's name. Jesus claims, I am. His Jewish opponents know exactly what he's saying. They take up stones to stone him to death. 2 chapters later, Jesus says to his opponents, I and the Father are one. I and the Father are one, the stones come out again. Whoever has seen me has seen the Father. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. These are exalted claims. He prays in chapter 17, Father, glorify me with the glory that I had in your presence before the world existed. He was with God before the world existed in glory. And finally, at the end of the gospel, doubting Thomas sees that Jesus has been raised from the dead, and he says, my Lord and my God. There is no doubt in the Gospel of John, both that Jesus is understood to be God and that he understands himself to be God. And so what's the problem? If you're asking, did Jesus think of himself as God, this is clear as day. He says he's God, right? Well, that's right. In the Gospel of John, he's portrayed as calling himself God. But I'm not asking whether he's portrayed as calling himself as God in the Gospel of John, which he is. I'm asking, did the man Jesus himself, the man who was walking around in Galilee, did he actually call himself God, or is John putting these words on his lips? Did the man actually call himself God, or are these words put on his lips? There is something very interesting to notice that many people have never noticed. We have 3 other Gospels in the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. These 3 Gospels were all written before the Gospel of John. They are based on written sources or oral sources that we can somewhat reconstruct. Scholars can reconstruct the sources on which the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are based. They're called synoptic Gospels because these 3 Gospels can be they tell so many of the same stories that you can put them in columns next to each other and you can read the same stories because they tell the same stories, so you can see them together. The word synoptic means to be seen together. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are synoptic Gospels. They tell many of the same stories, and they're based on written sources that you can somewhat reconstruct. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus does not call himself God. None of these sayings from the Gospel of John is in Matthew, Mark, or Luke, or in any of their sources. And all of those written sources about Jesus' words were earlier than the Gospel of John. That's very odd. Think about it for a second. Suppose you were a gospel writer in the early church and you're writing an account of Jesus, and everybody knows that Jesus called himself God. Would you leave that out? Like, That part isn't important enough to mention? That he thought he was God? Jesus doesn't call himself God in Matthew, Mark, or Luke, or their sources. How is that imaginable if, in fact, they knew that he called himself God? They just neglected to bring that part up? That's why scholars wonder whether the Gospel of John is historically accurate or not. I'm not saying that, I'm not denying its theological usefulness or its religious value. I'm simply asking, is it historical? And I think the answer is no. I think the Gospel of John is having Jesus mouth the words that explain the understanding of Jesus that the author of John had. John has put words on his lips, I think. Well, so I want to try and show that in the rest of this lecture. I want to try and show why it appears that the historical Jesus probably did not call himself God. Again, apart